Okay, so as everybody knows, bees are in trouble. Hardly ever a month goes by without something in the news and media about another decline in bees or something similar. And this has resulted even in the military-industrial complex in the form of Haagen-Dazs ice creams coming up with a research grant because some of their most profitable flavors require pollination, but they only give money towards people studying honeybees, and some of their most favored flavors, such as blueberries, are actually very poorly pollinated by honeybees, but honeybees always get the credit. I look at other bees, and these are the ones I'm going to be talking about today. So bees are in trouble, and one of the reasons bees are in trouble is that most people think they know what they are. This is the second American edition of a book called Bees of the World. That is a fly on the cover. So the authors who know, they can tell bees from flies. They've complained to the publishers, and the publishers say, no, entomologists tell us that that's a bee. So when I was asked to write a book, I said, okay, but you have to let me have control of the cover. And the first mock-up they sent me had a fly on the front. Okay, so here is the outline of my talk. I'm going to talk about misconceptions about bees. By the end of that, you'll be so confused I'll have to tell you what bees are. Then I'll talk about the diversity of bees, why they're important, and then towards the end, some interesting things, Canadian-led initiatives that help us understand bees. And then lastly, a little bit about what you can do practically. Okay, so what do you think of when somebody says bees? Honey? Stings? Pollination? Buzzing? Allergies, all right, getting hurt by them. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of things that come to mind when people think of bees. The first one is honey. Yes, honey is made by bees, but most bees don't make honey. There are very few bees that actually do make honey, and some bees, if they made honey, you wouldn't want it. There's a group of 3 species of tropical Central American bees that get the protein they need for their nest mates back in the hive from dead animals, such as this toad. That's not David Rubik, it is a toad. He just took the picture. So if you like a really strong brie, maybe you'd like the honey that these bees would make, but otherwise I suspect not. More recently, there's a group of stingless bees in Thailand that have been shown to get the protein they need for their offspring from the antibacterial enzymes in mammalian tears. Right, so these bees go to your eyeballs and suck them. So that's probably quite a salty honey. Another misconception is all bees work hard, certainly in the Canadian Arctic. But this time of year, bees can be flying around almost for 24 hours if it's warm enough, and they'll be active until they die. But lots of bees are cuckoo bees. They don't do any work at all. They just invade the nests of other bees and lay eggs on the food that's been supplied by the host. And a lot of these are rather wasp-like things, as you can see there. Okay, another misconception is that all bees live in hives. Usually, I can tell you're a young audience because most people laugh at this. The undergraduates don't understand it because they've never seen a beehive hairdo. So most bees nest in the ground. Each one of those brown spots you can see on the image on the left is the earth dug up at the entrance of a nest by a female digging down to start a new nest in spring. This is from the Isle of Wight in England, and there were 250 nests per square metre. That is nothing like the maximum that's been recorded, which is 2,000 nests per square metre, which is an enormous number. In fact, that nest site was discovered by a geologist driving around, and he saw something that he'd never noticed. He thought it was a new geological horizon or something, and it turned out to be just a bunch of dirt that the bees had kicked up at the entrance by digging down. Okay, another misconception is bees have got complex social lives. Certainly some of them do. if we see here, this is the giant honeybee from India, and these don't nest inside a hollow hive. They nest on the outside of a structure, and the outside of the nest is 3 worker bees deep. So if you bump your head on one of these colonies, that's curtains for you. And that nearly happened to me once when I was in India, because I was looking for bees on the ground and didn't notice that the mango tree right in front of me had one of these nests dangling down from it. Most bees are solitary. Most bee females her social interactions will involve mating with a male, laying eggs, and maybe defending the nest against other females that want to take it away from her. That's the total of the social life of most bees, because most bees are solitary. And here we see what the solitary bees do. Pollen ball, moistened with nectar to hold it together, inside a brood cell, lay an egg, close the door, and then they don't see their offspring again. So you don't get any of this. As a bee mother, there's no terrible twos. And another advantage in terms of the diapering aspects is that bee larvae defecate just once. When you're in a small room with all the food you need to grow to become an adult, the last thing you want to do is to start soiling it as soon as you start eating. And so they defecate right at the end of their larval life just once. And so that's a pretty nice way of doing things. Okay, all bees sting. Well, only female bees have got a sting to be able to sting with. The sting is a modified egg-laying apparatus, and the lubricant that enabled the waspy ancestors of bees to get the egg through that hollow tube, that's what changed to become venom, a venom gland in the bees and wasps that sting. So what we see here is an ancestral kind of waspy sting. That's the bit that will go in you, and all these other structures here are to move it around. Here we see the longest sting of any bee that I know of. This is a cuckoo bee, and it attacks nests of bees that live in stems, and it goes into the nest with the sting over its head and its mandibles ready, so it can, if the real owner is at home, it can attack from both ends at once. But what we see here, this is the sting shaft, the part that would normally go inside another organism. And this one here wouldn't be able to poke a hole in a piece of wet toilet paper. This is a bee that is completely incapable of stinging even in the females. So, very few bees make honey. Not many are social. Almost none of them nest in hives. A whole bunch of them are cuckoos that don't work. Only females sting, and then that's been lost many times independently in different lineages of bees. So why is it that you're surprised by this? And that's the reason. It's the honeybee. Honeybee has got all of those characteristics. The sting really hurts. The worker bees die when they sting you because the sting's got barbs that mean that their internal venom sac, etc., gets ripped out of their bodies when they fly away after the sting's stuck in you. They've got very complicated social lives. They make honey, etc. Oh, can you see? Oh, do I keep walking? There's two to see, isn't there? Okay, so what are bees? Bees are vegetarian digger wasps. So there we see a digger wasp. This is kind of like what bees would have looked like about 150 million years ago. It's paralyzed a caterpillar. That's what the origin of the sting is. The sting arose in the first place to paralyze prey so that the mother could take it into the nest for its offspring to eat. And so what this wasp has done is it's dug a nest in the ground. It's made a brood cell towards the side, deep in the underground. It's paralyzed the caterpillar. It will then lay an egg on it. And what happens is that because it's paralyzed the caterpillar stays fresh while it's eaten by her offspring. So it's a bit like having a flock of stunned chickens in the kitchen rather than a fridge. You don't need anything special as long as you can paralyze things. They stay fresh and your offspring can eat them. One of the reasons bees have lost the ability to sting so many times is that pollen doesn't need to be subdued. You can just collect it. It's not going to fight back. Okay, so here we see the evil origin of bees. These are cockroach wasps, or the kind of jewel wasps, biological control agents in New York. These are the mud dauber wasps and the great golden diggers. These are the things that make the nice mud cylinders on the outside of your cottage or on the outside of your home if you're lucky. The crabronids, these are the closest relatives of bees. And this particular species here actually hunts honeybees to take back to its nest for its offspring. But most of them go for flies or Lepidoptera, beetles, etc. Okay. So here's the world's oldest bee. It's about 100 million years old. It's very small. It's very unusual. It's quite controversial. Some people don't believe that it's a bee. But this is some nice images of an amber fossil. And that's the artist's rendition of some parts of what the thing looks like. So is that a bee or a wasp? Hands up who thinks it's a bee. Hands up who thinks it's a wasp. Hands up who's not thinking. That's disappointing. That's a bee. And I've been studying bees for, well, when I made a mistake similar to this, I've been studying bees for 36 years. And I was out in the field in Mexico with a Mexican colleague. And he said, have you found any of these? And I said, I saw those, but I thought they were wasps. So it's actually very difficult to tell bees from wasps, but that's because they're so closely related. So how do you tell whether something's a bee? It's very easy. If it's got branched hairs, it's a bee. How easy is that to tell when it's flying around in the backyard? Another way you can tell a bee from a wasp is the structure of the sting apparatus. That's even more difficult to tell while it's flying around in the backyard, and it can be rather painful if you try it at home. It's even more difficult because some bees are almost bald. That bee there carries pollen and nectar for its offspring home inside its stomach, which is actually down here. But it's almost bald, but somewhere on its body it has branched hairs. So actually telling a bee apart from a non-bee is actually very difficult, but you can do it with a lot of practice and get it right some of the time. Okay, so there's over 20,000 different species of bees. One of my students described the 20,000th species just last year. It says earlier this year. I should have updated that. It was actually last year. We've got over 800 species in Canada, and in a couple of months we're going to be putting up online an image bank of all of the species of Canada, apart from the few that we haven't been able to find specimens of from museums that will let us borrow them to take pictures. So I'm going to go through the bee diversity. There are 7 different families of bees. This is the way biologists classify things, families, etc. Linnaeus started that in the 1750s. The first family is the smallest. It's the Stenotrididae. You've got to go to Australia to see these. And the world expert on these is an expert tennis player. This is necessary because these things fly like the blazes. I've never seen bees fly so fast. I could see one coming towards me once so fast, I just waved the net up and down like that, hoping that it didn't see it, and I caught it. But, it's the same movements trying to catch these fast-flying bees as when you're playing tennis. The Caledids, we have 2 genera in Canada. One looks like this, and these are the bees that you'll see coming out of the ground in parks, Hyde Park, Lambton Park, in vast numbers around this time of year. And then the other genus we get in Canada is that bald black bee that I showed you a picture of a minute ago. This one here is one of my favorites. It's a bit like somebody that lives in a high-rise with a supermarket in the basement, because it nests in the dried stems of this plant here, which is called Nolana, where the stems have been hollowed out by a beetle. And then it collects pollen and nectar from the flowers of the same plant. So it doesn't have to go far to complete its life cycle. The solitary mining bees, these are also particularly common in spring. Most of them aren't as pretty as this one. Most of them are comparatively dull and inconspicuous species. Andrena is the largest genus, or second largest genus, maybe it's the largest genus in Canada. It's the largest genus of bees worldwide. There's over 1,200 species, and they can't sting. The halictids, or sweat bees, these are, this thing is common. If you live downtown, these will be nesting on your street, and you'll see them late in summer. The males are diagnostic by having yellow and black stripes at the back and bright green at the front. The females are either all bright green or bright green and black and white at the back. And these, you'll find them flying around rows of Sharon and other large flowers late in summer. The males will sleep in the flowers. Mellidids, these are weird things. Not many species, most of them are in Africa. This one here is a very large waspy bee. It's going to these cleome flowers. It first goes to the red pink spot there. The flower is telling the bee where to go to get nectar. It lands there and then it slides down the anthers like a kid going down the stair banister, collecting pollen as it goes. So it's kind of an efficient and kind of fun way of getting your work done. And then we've got these long-legged bees, which are totally weird. So there's coevolution between the length of the legs of the species of bee and the length of the floral spurs of the flowers they go to, which are diascia flowers in South Africa. And these things fly around with the legs like this. And they've got the ability to wake up in the morning and immediately jump into your sweater with both arms all the way through to the end. I don't know how they do it. I've seen video footage of it, but they're like this. They land on the flower and immediately their legs have got all the way to the end of these narrow tubes that the flowers got oils at the end of, which the bees have got special hairs to suck up the oils at the end of their feet. Leafcutter bees. These are economically important. If you eat meat only, meat and dairy, 15% of meat and dairy comes from alfalfa. And the alfalfa leafcutter bee, which is very similar to this one here, is a Canadian export. And we're the best at managing these of anywhere in the world. And then we've got that Anthidium bee, the wool carder bee again. This is the one, this time it's collecting nectar, but this is the one that I showed you a picture of earlier, collecting hairs from flowers. And then the Apidae, this is the family that contains the bees everybody knows about, the bumblebees and the honeybees, but it also includes some of these cuckoo bees like this one. And this is a whole bunch of orchid bees attracted to baits. So these are pretty weird things. So it's the males that go to orchids. And the reason they do this is to collect fragrances from the orchids, not nectar and pollen, but fragrances. And they store their fragrances, in specially modified sponges in the hind legs. And then they gather to attract females. And the females prefer the male that's got the most complicated bouquet. So if he smells like a complicated, expensive wine, yes. If it's like cheap plonk, no. And what this ends up with then is that the young orchid bee males will steal the fragrances from the legs of a recently deceased orchid bee. So from a female's point of view, a dead male smells better than a teenager. Okay, so why is it that bees are important? Well, there wouldn't be much in the way of wild flowers without them. Without wild flowers, there wouldn't be nuts and berries. Without nuts and berries, there wouldn't be bears, etc., etc. They pollinate a lot of our fruits and vegetables. Pollination biologists would be out of a job without them. And bees are also excellent for environmental monitoring, and that's what I'm going to concentrate on. But first of all, this. If the bee disappeared off the surface of the globe, man would have only 4 years of life left. Woman, being more adaptable, might last for 6. Einstein scholars can find no evidence that he said this, but it's one of these urban myths. But what we can tell about him is he sure had no idea what a bee looked like. Now, that's a fly. It's only got 2 wings. So here's breakfast with bees. Fruit, orange juice, lots of coffee. Here's breakfast without bees. Pretty boring. Right, you still get coffee because coffee is self-pollinated. It's self-compatible and it can be pollinated by the wind. But if you've got bees carrying pollen around, the yield of coffee is a lot more. And so without bees, coffee will be a lot more expensive and we'd all be that much more grumpy in the morning. Here's a plot of the human population from 1950. For just 100 years, the number of us is going to increase from 2.5 million to getting on towards 2.5 billion to almost 9 billion people in 100 years. Greatest growth that's happening is in developing countries. And this is coincident with areas where agriculture is decreasing. This is predictions. This is before the most recent reports, which were released just a month or so ago. But this is predictions of the impact of climate change on agricultural productivity around the world. If you're in a red area, you're in trouble. If you're in a blue area, you're fine. Look where all the red areas are. All right, so, go to Kazakhstan, right? They're going to be all right. They're going to be able to grow plenty of food in Kazakhstan. I'm not sure the political setup there is very good, and by the way things are going, Putin's going to invade anyway. But most of these places where the population is growing the fastest are also the areas where food productivity is expected to decrease by at least 15%. Climate change has got something to do with that, in fact most of it. Here we see, this is the Julian date from the beginning of the year, so that would be end of February. And this will be end of March, so April. This is here the timing of blackcurrant flowering. The green dots, pretty much the same. It's come forward a few days. But the bee that likes going to blackcurrants, that's now coming out a whole month earlier than it was 40 years ago. Fortunately, blackcurrants are visited by more than just this one bee, so there's no need for you to go out and buy all the blackcurrants you want for the rest of your life now, because the cost's going to become prohibitive. But this is just one example of the ecological interactions, some of them economically important or nutritionally essential for us, where climate change is interfering with these normal processes. I said earlier that honeybees get all the credit. This is the study that shows that that's incorrect. So what this is on the vertical axis is 3 different estimates of the proportion of agricultural productivity in Britain that was brought to us by honeybees. And what they did in this was that they assumed that every hive was in the optimum place for it to be in relation to other hives throughout the year. So this is a very positive assumption for the honeybee. But even so, by 2007, the data suggested that of all of the agricultural productivity in Britain that required a pollinator, honeybees were responsible for at most a third, and most likely half of that. These are 3 different estimates depending upon the mathematical models they used. So in Britain, honeybees are responsible for perhaps a fifth of the pollination, and it's other bees and some flies that are doing the rest. In Canada, honeybees are probably more important because in Britain, if you've got a field that's 100 meters across, it's considered large. Right? Whereas in this country, if you've got a field that's less than a kilometre across, it's considered small. And the bees live in around the edges of these fields usually. And so in Britain, this is going to be, the wild bees are going to be more important than they are in Canada because our industrial agriculture is such a large scale thing. Okay. So the best study of the impact of wild bees on pollination was done in California and watermelons. It takes 2,500 pollen grains to get you a decent watermelon. Fewer than that and it's asymmetrical. People don't want to pay for an asymmetrical or a shrunk looking watermelon. But 2,500 pollen grains, that'll get you a decent watermelon. This study compared traditional farms that use pesticides with organic farms, and it also looked at organic farms that were close to natural habitat and those that were surrounded by other farms. And they found that wild bees alone were perfectly good for an economically viable crop every year of the study if they were close to natural habitat. If they were a long way away from natural habitat, some years the wild bees did a fine job, some years the farmer needed to bring in honeybees. On the conventional farm that's using pesticides, they needed to bring in honeybees all the time. These are just 4 of the 42 different species of wild bee, actually one of them honeybee, 41 species of wild bee that was visiting these watermelon flowers in this study. And one of the saddest things about this was that the wild bee that was the best pollinator of watermelons was the first one to drop out as the habitat deteriorated. Okay, so bees as environmental monitors. I'll explain what I mean by this. So we know the world's changing. Bees are particularly sensitive to these changes. And there are 20,000 species out there. Their ecology is very diverse. And so the reason that we think bees are particularly sensitive to the environment is a result of the combination of two of most people's favorite obsessions, at least Woody Allen's favorite obsessions. That's sex and death. So sex in bees is determined in an unusual way. With us, it's a chromosome. If two X's, you're a female, X and a Y, you're a male. In bees, it's genotype at a single sex locus. Okay, so it's a bit more like blood groups. And so, in human beings. So at the sex locus, if you've got two different alleles, two variants, A and B for a blood group, I and J in the example here, then you're a healthy diploid female. But the females produce healthy males through unfertilized eggs. Virgin birth for a bee, you get boys, and you get healthy boys. Now, if this female mates with a Mr. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, or K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, and there is a whole rainbow of different sex alleles in a healthy population, then everything's fine. All of her fertilized eggs are females, and all of her unfertilized eggs are healthy males. But if she mates with a Mr. J or a Mr. I, then half of her fertilized eggs contain two copies of the same allele. In this case, that one and that one, two J's. So this has only got one copy of something at the sex, it's only got one version of something at the sex locus, but it's two copies of the same thing. And so what happens here then is that you get a diploid male. Diploid males are attempts at female production, but they're dysfunctional. So diploid males are either inviable, they die, or they're viable and they mate, but they waste the reproductive opportunities of the female they mate with because the sperm they produce doesn't work. Or it's recently been found in a few examples that they produce triploid offspring, which have got 3 copies of all the genes, and that makes things even worse. So a grad student in my lab nearly 10 years or so ago did some computer simulations of the effects of this on extinction. So what we look at here is the probability of extinction on the vertical axis. Here's how big the population can get on this axis, and this is the number of offspring per female. The numbers are quite small, but because bees provide all the food for the complete development of their offspring, it's a bit like having a bedroom, you put 18 years of groceries in there, give birth and close the door. They can't produce many offspring because it takes so much effort to do that. So most solitary bees, and most bees are solitary, have got a very few number of offspring produced. So this is what the extinction rate is for organisms like us and birds and butterflies. So the extinction rate, according to the computer simulations, is very low unless you can at most reproduce yourself and your partner, and the population can only grow to 50. Well, that's vanishingly small. That's unreasonable. But as soon as you put in viable diploid males, this bee and wasp sex-determining mechanism, you get this great big red wall of death. And if the males waste the reproductive efforts of their mates, that becomes even worse. So what this demonstrated to us is that bees are far more likely to go extinct once their population gets small than any other group of organisms, except their close relatives, like wasps and ants. And so bees then their populations are going to wink out much more easily than those of other organisms. Okay, so there's all this great diversity of bees. Should we be studying some of them in particular more than others? And the answer to that is yes. This is the sundrops bee. It's a specialist. It only collects pollen and nectar from sundrops. Enothera, plant in the Onagraceae. These things grow in Toronto. These are common flowers on the street I live on. And the bees here get up at dawn, and they've finished by 9 a.m. Right, so it was one of my students that took these pictures because I don't like getting up early. Most bees don't get up early either, so it's a perfect match. But what happens here is that these bees, instead of having lots of pollen collecting hairs on their hind leg, they've got a comb. And they have this comb because the pollen, and you can test this out if you've got any of these in your garden, or if one of your neighbours got one. When you see these plants in bloom, just jump over the fence and try fondling the flowers. The pollen grains of Enothera are held together by little spider web-like threads. And so the bees can go in there and comb out all of the pollen in a flower. And the first one that gets there gets just about every pollen grain. And so that's why there's been competition. The bee that gets there the first gets all the resources. So specialist bees are reliant upon one or a couple of closely related species of flowers. And without that flower being around, they can't get food for their offspring. So we expect specialist bees to be more susceptible to any environmental degradation. And this is a rather complicated, that's one of my favorite bees. That's just gorgeous. And it likes going to loasa flowers, which is a stinging plant in the Atacama Desert. Okay, so what we've got here on the vertical axis is a proxy for how big the population is. That's based on indirect methods. For 5 different groups of bees, where in one pair, 5 different sets of pairs, where in one pair one's a specialist and one's a generalist. So on average, the specialist populations are about 1/10 that of the generalists. And the generalists aren't affected by what flowers are out there. Almost any flower is good for them. But the specialists have got a very tight relationship with one or just a few plants. And so they're more susceptible. And so that as a result, they naturally have lower populations. Cuckoo bees. These rely upon the host bees, and so it's almost like predators in a food chain being more susceptible to negative impacts on the environment than are the herbivores. And so what we've got here is a cuckoo bee that only attacks nests of this bee here, and this bee here only goes to flowers of tomatillo, physalis. And there is a wild physalis that we get in southern Ontario, and these bees are very effective pollinators of it, and this bee lays eggs in the nests. So we've got this 3 ecological levels of the plant, the bee that only goes to that plant, and the cuckoo bee that only goes to that host. And so the cuckoo bee in particular might be expected to be in trouble as the environment declines. This is a specialist bee that we have in Canada, probably. And this is a cuckoo bee that attacks it, and it was thought to be extinct until it was rediscovered in 2003. Nobody's seen it there since. So the third group of bees which are particularly good at monitoring the state of the environment are social bees like bumblebees. These need resources in spring, summer, and fall. Most bees are active only for a couple of weeks, and then they're inactive underneath the ground. So if this was a normal year, some bees would have finished already. Right, the very first plants that bloom, like maple catkins, there are bees that collect pollen from those. When the maple catkins are gone, the bees are gone. So they're out for a couple of weeks only. And so only something that impacts the flowers that are around that short period of time will impact bees that are solitary, that only come out for a couple of weeks. But if you're a social bee, you need resources April, May, June, July, August, September, sometimes into October. And so anything that impacts the flowers in the area any time of year is going to have a negative impact upon a social bee. So here we see Bombus affinis. This orange patch here, if it's got yellow surrounding it like this, you've got a Bombus affinis, and you have to tell me with photographic evidence. This used to be the 3rd most common bumblebee in southern Ontario. You would get it in your garden in the 70s and 80s. Starting in the 1990s, it started disappearing. For the last 12 years, in Canada, it's only been found at the Pinery Provincial Park. Nowhere else. You can buy a t-shirt at the park that says, Bombus affinis, in a Pinery Park, the last stand, and it's the last place in Canada where you can see this bee as far as we know. And an ex-PhD student in my lab, Sheila Kohler, studied this for 5 or 6 years, and it's become very rare also in the United States. So it's not surprising then that Bombus affinis is a social bee, and that cuckoo bee I just showed you a picture of were the first 2 bees to be added to the Endangered Species Act in Canada, because bees are a lot more likely to go extinct, and these ones are even more likely to be in trouble because of their ecological attributes. So when these bees were listed, what made the news? Bluefin tuna. Our food depends on bees. We can get by without tuna. We can't get by so easily without bees. Without bees, food production decreased worldwide by 30% or so. So we'd survive as long as we had hegemony over enough of the rest of the world to keep us in the quality of life that we want. So the media got the wrong message there. Okay, so I'm telling you bees are important. We should be using them to help us understand the state of the environment. Why aren't we using them more? Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons, but one of them is that they're difficult to identify. Even to tell something is a bee as a start is a problem. But there are, and these problems of identification apply all over the place. This is the African continent's best stingless beekeeper. His name is Stanley. He lives on the edge of the only remaining patch of intact rainforest in Kenya. And all of these wooden boxes here contains a stingless bee colony. He is certain that the species in that box and that box are different because they behave differently, and he's observed them. The bee experts tell him they can't tell a difference between them in terms of their structure, and so the farmer seems to have a better understanding than the experts do in this instance, but we really need better tools to help us identify things. So some solutions: increase the general background knowledge. I hope I'm doing that. Have identification guides that are nice and fun to use. DNA barcoding I'll be talking about, and then bee-friendly practices, I'll end on that. And so if you Google Canadian Journal of Arthropod Identification, and you can type that number of letters in without making a mistake in the spelling, you'll get to the Canadian Journal of Arthropod Identification. And if you scroll down to the third from last one there, you'll get this, which is a key to the genera of bees in eastern Canada. And it's all imaged. Everything you need to look at is there on the screen for you to compare. So if you've got a computer and a microscope, you'll be able to identify any bee genus in the country. If any of you have used identification keys that aren't like this in the past, you know, hare's glabrous, hare's hirsute, but glabrous means bald. You know, why don't they say bald? Because we feel better if we use longer words. Anyway, basal vein strongly curved, basal vein not strongly curved. Who's to say what a strong curve is, and who knows where the basal vein is unless somebody's pointing it out to you? So that's what we do in this key. And here's, this is made possible by a Canadian Fund for Innovation grant for a very fancy imaging system. Here's my technician with a couple of leafcutter bee mandibles just about to chop her head off. DNA barcoding, Canadian invention. It uses part of the mitochondrial genome, the CO1 gene on the mitochondrion, which is inherited only through the mother, and so mutations in the mother are passed on to the next generations, and then on to the next generation. They don't mix, and so that's why it's useful. And so what we do is we pull a bee leg off, put it in one of these plates here. We then amplify the DNA for the CO1 gene. We send it to the DNA sequencer, and we get a series of the bases in the DNA, the A's, the C's, the G's, and the T's. And we can turn this into a similarity tree. And if you get something like an almost vertical line, that means that the sequences are exactly the same or very, very similar. If you get a long horizontal line, then that means that the sequences are very different. And this way we can tell apart different species. So here we see the leafcutter bees of Canada. This is one species here. The sequences are very similar. That's 1% sequence divergence. So within a species here, we've got at most about 0.3. But between the species here, we've got about 10. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You can keep counting. But within a species, the sequences are very similar. Between them, they're usually very different. And so this is a way in which you can identify a bee just from a small piece of tissue. Okay, now it sounds cruel taking the leg off of a bee. We take them off a dead specimen, so it's not so cruel. But if you're interested in conservation or finding out what's in your garden, all you need to do is to take an antenna from a bee, put it into ethanol, and then we can get the DNA sequence from the antenna, and you can let the bee go. You've just taken an antenna from a bee. How cruel is that? Well, I can tell you that within minutes of having an antenna chopped off, the males are chasing the females on the flowers straight away. It doesn't stop them, randy buggers. The females I've seen with an antenna removed, they're flying around pollinating flowers and collecting pollen weeks later. which is about as long as they normally survive anyway. So you can find out what bees are using this Canadian-developed technique by Paul Hebert at the University of Guelph, just by taking an antenna off and then letting the bee go. Okay, so we're getting towards the end now. So what can you do to help the bees? Well, try not to use insecticides. Buy organic if you can afford it. Plant native plants, or at least flowers that aren't complicated. I like gladioli, but bees can't get their way into the pollen in those flowers. You get the wild rose of Alberta, beautiful open pink flower with yellow anthers in the middle. It's an open invitation to come and have lunch. You get one of these fancy roses and the bees have to fight their way through all those petals to get into the middle where the pollen is. And so the simpler the flowers in general, the better. Have bare soil patches in the garden. Most bees nest in the ground. Don't mulch, or mulch as little as possible. I get into trouble with gardeners because I say don't mulch, and they say, but we have to. Well, would you like a whole pile of compost poured on top of your house? I don't think so. Leave old dead stems around the house. This is the time of year when everybody puts out the dead stems from the previous year's gardening. Right? Thousands of bees are being taken away for recycling on every street by doing that. Depends on the plant, the stems of which you put out there. Raspberry canes are the best. I have 3 different genera of bees nesting in raspberry canes in my garden, and I keep them. In fact, the old ones, if they're really, I bundle them up and keep them. We don't throw them out. And raspberries, the flowers are open and simple, like the wild rose of Alberta. Lots of different bees like raspberry flowers, and who doesn't like the fruits? This is my backyard. There's the endangered pink flamingo. See, I'm a conservation biologist all around. I give talks sometimes to horticultural societies, and people stand up and shout at me when they, what can I do to help the bees without having my garden look ugly like yours? Well, there's the raspberry patch. There's a bundle of old raspberry canes hung up. I actually don't do very well like that. It's much better just to leave them. This is a grape arbor, and I've got large carpenter bees nesting in there. You can hear them chew through the wood. Eventually it will fall down. I hope I'm not under it when that happens, but if it does, I'm glad that the bees have had a great time. In fact, we fed woodpeckers 2 summers ago. A woodpecker came along and drilled a bunch of holes on the other side, just about there, and took out all of the larvae that the large carpenter bee had put in there.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Bees, do the eggs remain there? Does anything remain in the holes over the winter?
It's the adults. The adults survive the winter. Yeah. So we got bees nesting there. We might have bees nesting in the ground, but by the time it's late summer, I can't see the ground because it's overgrown because I plant my vegetables too close together. My neighbor here, you can see everything's in neat rows. All right, she gets a lot of trouble with raccoons eating the vegetables. The raccoons come into our garden, they can't see anywhere around. It's like, all right, I'm going back into the neighbor's. At least I can see where I'm going. So we don't have any trouble with raccoons. In fact, we have lab parties on the patio at the back, which is about here, and sometimes the raccoons join in. They walk along the side of the house.
So you don't have a compost in the back?
We do. The composter is there, just behind. It's in the shade, so you can't see it. But we do. In fact, at this time we had 2. There was another one there, but we only have 1 now.
Your compost doesn't attract raccoons?
They can't get there because of all the mess around it. I think sometimes, but we've put a wire cage over it that's held down by wood on either side, and that seems to keep them away. But we really, touch wood so far, we haven't had any trouble with them. Okay, so you can construct nests, or at least don't destroy them. So you can put bundles of these things up in your garden, and you can see the earth that's been stuck at the end of the trap nesting bee. One of my students has got over 200 study sites like this in the Greater Toronto area. He's got a lot of data to analyze. Here's one of my raspberry canes with a masked bee. That's the black, almost bald one I showed you a picture of earlier, peeking out. It's one of the 3 genera nesting in raspberries in my garden. And so here we see a bee finishing off on a bamboo cane, or bamboo-like cane, in the garden. It's just putting chewed leaves to hide the entrance so that predators think it's just a stem rather than something with bee larvae on the inside. Okay, so bees are spectacularly gorgeous. I hope I've convinced you of that just by showing the pictures without pointing it out. It's, it's obvious to me, but then I spend as many hours as I possibly can looking at them under the microscope. I mentioned that we've got an image bank of the bee species of Canada. If you Google bee tribe images, you'll get to one of my websites where it's got pictures of just about all the tribes of bees in the world. And some of those are spectacularly gorgeous, most of them are. And we're going to we've started working on a bee genera of the world. There's over 500 of those, image bank also. And I actually don't know how many specimens I've got in the collection. It's over 250,000. It might be 400,000. Who can count that number? So bees are super important as well, not only by providing us with some of the nutritionally most interesting foods like nuts and fruits and berries, but also because they're important for telling us something about the state of the environment. So I have to thank a whole bunch of funding agencies, which in the past have given me quite a lot of money. We're now actually reaching quite a low point, which is kind of surprising, but what the heck. We'll do what we can. Lots of people took pictures, and you can download a lot of these images free from my website, which is Bugs R Us. So, thank you.